Hi guys, so we are back today with our book, The Witches by Roald Dahl. And just like I said before, today we're going to do the next chapter. It's called My Grandmother. I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of the words that we're going to see in this chapter that are a little bit trickier for us. The three words that I want to focus in on are peculiar, enthralled, and vanish. So, vanish is probably the one that you are most familiar with. It just means to disappear. But peculiar is a word that we could use in our language every day because it means something just as simple as strange. So if something is strange or extraordinary, or something that you don't see very often, that's kind of what peculiar means. And then the word enthralled. The word enthralled just means like you're really kind of astounded by it, or it's almost shocking or exciting, something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on reading this chapter for you, and I'll show you the pictures as we go. I do have some questions that go with this one at the end that I will read off for you, so feel free to pause, write them down, and get ready for those answers because, like I said before, anybody who's willing to do the answers that go along with these questions for each chapter, I'm willing to give you some bonus points, just depending on how much work you put in for that. So here we go. My grandmother. I myself had two separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first, I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion, I was not so lucky. Things happened to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I am still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother is Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forest and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there and had lived there and had started going to an English school. Twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages, and I have to admit that I felt closer to her than to my mother. Soon after my 7th birthday, my parents took me as usual to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway. And it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut on my forehead. I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back in my grandmother's house with her arms around me tight and both of us crying the whole night long. Here's the picture. This is our narrator and his grandmother. What are we going to do now? I asked her through the tears. You will stay here with me, she said, and I will look after you. Aren't I going back to England? No, she said, I could never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones. The very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't become really excited until she got on the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were history. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I had better believe it. What was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that too. Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Really and truly truthful? My darling, she said, you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one. But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama. So how can I spot them? You must listen to me, my grandmother said. You must remember everything that I tell you. After that, all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best. We were in the big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see the huge snowflakes falling slowly onto an outside world that was black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive, wide body which was smothered in gray lace. She sat there, majestic in her armchair, filling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in to sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, wearing pajamas, dressing gown, and slippers. You swear you aren't pulling my leg, I kept saying to her. You swear you aren't just pretending? Listen, she said. I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them. I still think you're just trying to frighten me, I said. I am trying to make sure you don't go the same way, she said. I love you and I want you to stay with me. Tell me about the children who disappeared, I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelt of burning rubber. The first child I knew who disappeared, she said, was called Ragnhild Hansen. Ragnhild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn. Her mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. Where's Ragnhild? She asked. She went away with the tall lady, the little sister said. What tall lady? Said the mother. The tall lady with the white gloves, the little sister said. She took Ragnhild by the hand and led her away. No one, my grandmother said, ever saw Ragnhild again. Didn't they search for her? I asked. They searched for miles around. Everyone in town helped, but they never found her. What happened to the other 4 children? I asked. They vanished, just as Ragnhild did. How, Grandmama? How did they vanish? In every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened. But how did they vanish? I asked. The second one was very peculiar, my grandmother said. There was a family called Christensen. They lived up in Holmenkollen, and they had an old oil painting in the living room, which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside a farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on a grassy farmyard in a farmhouse in the background. Here's the picture of Grandmama telling our narrator the stories. You can see the details the author talked about there. She's got her cigar. Our narrator's sitting on the floor in his robe and pajamas. Grandma's sitting in the armchair. It was a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day their daughter Solveig came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street. The next morning, little Solveig was not in her bed. The parents searched everywhere, but they couldn't find her. Then, all of a sudden, her father shouted, "There she is! That's Solveig feeding the ducks!" He was pointing at the oil painting, and sure enough, Solveig was in it. Here's Solveig in the oil painting that the family had in their home. Feeding the ducks, just like Dad said. She was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of the basket. The father rushed up to the painting and touched her, but that didn't help. She was simply part of the painting, just a painting, a picture painted on canvas. Did you ever see that painting, Grandmama, with the little girl in it? Many times, my grandmother said, and the peculiar thing about little Solveig kept changing her position in the picture. One day, she would actually be inside the farmhouse, and you could see her little face looking out through the window. Another day, she would be far over to the left with a duck in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmother? Nobody did. Wherever she was, whether she was hiding outside, feeding the ducks, or sitting inside looking out the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was all very odd, my grandmother said. Very odd indeed. And what was the most odd of all is that as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. Then, all at once, 54 years after it all happened, she had disappeared from the picture altogether. You mean she died? I said. Who knows, my grandmother said. Some very mysterious things go on in a world of witches. That's two you've told me about, I said. What happened to the third one? The third one was little Birgit Svensson. My grandmother said, she lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month, she had turned into a large white chicken. Her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden. She even laid eggs. What color? Eggs, I said. Brown one, my grandmother said. Biggest eggs I've ever seen in my life. Her mother made omelets out of them. Delicious they were. I gazed up at my grandmother, who sat there like some ancient queen on her throne. Her eyes were misty gray, and they seemed to be looking at something many miles away. That cigar was the only real thing about her at that moment, and the smoke it billowed round her head in blue clouds. Here's a picture of Miss Svensson there. Birgit Svensson in her chicken form. There it is. But the little girl who became a chicken didn't disappear, I said. No, not Birgit. She lived on for many years laying her brown eggs. You said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I am getting old. I can't remember everything. What happened to the fourth child? I asked. The fourth child was a boy called Harold, my grandmother said. One morning his skin went all grayish yellow. Then it became hard and crackly like the shell of a nut. By evening, the boy had turned to stone. Stone? I said. Like real stone? Granite, she said. I'll take you to see him if you like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in the hall like a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. There's Harold. Although I was very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me. And yet she spoke with such conviction, with such utter seriousness, and with never a smile on her face or a twinkle in her eye, that I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, Grandmama, I said. You told me there were 5 altogether. What happened to the last one? Would you like a puff of my cigar? She said. I'm only 7, Grandmama. I don't care what age you are, she said. You'll never catch a cold if you smoke cigars. What about number 5, Grandmama? Number 5, she said, chewing at the end of her cigar, as though it were a delicious asparagus, was a rather interesting case. A 9-year-old boy called Leif was summer holidaying with his family on the fjord. And the whole family was picnicking and swimming off some rocks on one of those little islands. Young Leif dived into the water, and his father, who was watching him, noticed that he stayed under for an unusually long time. When he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leif anymore. What was he, Grandmama? He was a porpoise. He wasn't. He couldn't have been. He was a lovely young porpoise, she said, and as friendly as can be. Grandmama, I said. Yes, my darling. Did you really and truly think he turned into a porpoise? Absolutely, she said. I knew his mother well. She told me all about it. She told me how Leaf the porpoise stayed with them all that afternoon, giving his brothers and sisters rides on his back. They had a wonderful time. Then he waved a flipper at them and swam away, never to be seen again. But Grandmama, I said, how did they know the porpoise was actually Leaf? He talked to them, my grandmother said. He laughed and joked with them all the time he was giving them rides. But wasn't there a most tremendous fuss when this happened? I asked. Not much, my grandmother said. You must remember that here in Norway we are used to that sort of thing. There are witches everywhere. There's probably one living on our street right this very moment. Now, it's time you went to bed. A witch couldn't come through my window at night, would she? I asked, quaking a little. No, my grandmother said. A witch will never do silly things like climbing up drain pipes or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along, I'll tuck you in. So that's the end of our chapter about our narrator's grandmother. The next one is going to be about how to recognize a witch. They told us we would learn all about how to recognize a witch. And so that's going to be what we read about in our next chapter. I have your questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and say them for you now. There's going to be 3 of them, and they're all about things that you can go right back into the text and find for yourself. If you don't have a copy of the text, then obviously you're going to have to do this the best you can from your memory. Feel free to go back and listen to parts of the story. You can pause, rewind, play parts again. And as I say your questions, if you're planning on submitting them for additional credit, you should pause after I read the question and write the question down for yourself. That way you can spend some time working on those answers after a while. So number 1 for the question is, why does the narrator end up living with his grandmother? So think back in our story to when the narrator first tells us how he came about living with his grandmother instead of his parents. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is, in grandmother's story that she's telling our narrator, what happened to Birgit Svensson? So go back to that part in the story where we're talking about Birgit Svensson and describe what grandmother says happened to Birgit in this story. And then number 3 is, why are witches so dangerous? I want you to use some text evidence to support that. The story tells us in the last actually 2 parts that we've read why witches are so dangerous. You can talk about specific places in the text that it says it, give specific examples. And in all of these, if you're going to submit them, please make sure that you're writing in complete sentences, doing good 3rd grade work. I'm happy to give you some additional credit if you give me your best effort. But that's it for today, guys. In the next chapter, we'll be reading all about how you can spot a witch.